Hey, what's up my friends? Graham Baldwin here from the Speaker Lab. Welcome back to another speech breakdown where today we're going to be taking a talk from Jordan Peterson, and he's going to be talking about his book, The 12 Rules of Life. And so we're going to be taking this presentation. This is the first time I've seen this, and so I got a lot to react to. I'll tell you a couple right out of the gate here. One thing I really like is the audience setup, all right? So make sure you pay attention to that. We're going to be talking about that. Also going to be talking about the difference between an audience that has to be there and an audience that wants to be there, and how to handle both of those differently, all right? Several things he doesn't do as well that I'd like to see him improve on, how he's moving around the stage, his eye contact with the audience, or a lack thereof. So a lot to get to today, so let's get right into today's speech breakdown.
So without further ado, please welcome one of the world's great public intellectuals, Jordan Peterson. Thank you.
Okay, let's stop and talk about this room for a second here. This is a great room for a couple of reasons. One is it's very, very crowded. It's very, very packed, which is it could potentially be what the opposite of what you might think it should be. You know, you want people to be spread out and everyone to be comfortable. But really, whenever it comes to speaking is very much an energy-based thing, meaning that the more people that there are, the closer that they are together, the more energy and momentum that creates for the audience and also for the speaker. So actually this is a really good setup. Before we've even heard anything that the speaker is going to present, if I walk into this room as a speaker, I'm immediately excited because of the density of the crowd here. So this is a really good setup. I think on the recording they turned the audio off here because the applause is too much to handle. All right, let's talk about something else here. So they just introduced Jordan Peterson. He walks out on stage, clearly gets a long applause here. It's a packed house, gets a standing ovation before he speaks. So that's one of the things to realize as we get into this breakdown. And again, I have not seen this yet, but there's a difference between an audience that wants to be there and an audience that has to be there. Wants to be there versus has to be there. So in this case, my sense is that they probably want to be there. This is a group of people that is very excited to see Jordan Peterson. It's not like they are just coming to a random lecture, or this is something that their boss made them attend and they're like, I have no idea who the speaker is. It's kind of like the difference between like, I'm going to go see a comedian perform. I'm just going to a comedy show that I don't really know who the comedian is, but I'm just going to see the comedy, versus like, I'm going to see this specific comedian, or I'm going to some type of music venue just to hear music and live music, or hear a band, versus I'm going to hear this specific band or this specific artist. So there's two very different approaches there. And so it creates a different energy and excitement level and anticipation from the audience when they are there for this specific speaker. That also means that before he even says anything, he already has some instant rapport and some instant connection with the audience, that if he didn't have, if they didn't have that same connection already, he's not going to have that level of rapport right out of the gate. So interesting to see what he does with this energy. They are excited to see him. Jerry Seinfeld does a good bit about standing ovations, that you know, you have a couple people that, not everybody stands at once. You have a couple people that start it, and then everyone else is like, all right, are we doing this? I guess we're doing this. We have to do this, right? Because you can't be the one that's just sitting there. That just feels awkward.
Well, that was nice.
Now notice there that pause was really powerful, because everybody sits down and there's a real anticipation there. So whatever he says at that moment, he has a real, he really has the audience's attention. So just something to kind of break the ice, break the tension there, is a good just throwaway line.
Oh. So I thought I'd talk about my book tonight. I've given 2 talks now, and I didn't actually talk directly about it. I sort of talked around it. But, so I thought, I don't like to give the same talk twice. So I thought I'd actually walk through it and outline it a little bit.
Let's talk about something he just mentioned there. I don't like to give the same talk twice. So for a speaker, sometimes speakers assume that every time you're giving a presentation, you always have to give a different presentation. That's not really the case. Oftentimes, the best speakers in the world aren't speakers who every time they speak, they're telling they're giving a different speech or different presentation. What oftentimes they do is they have one talk that is really, really well dialed in, and they use that one over and over and over again. It's kind of the same way. Let's go back to like the musician analogy for a second. When you go see a musician, you don't want them just to like try to, this is the first time I've ever performed this. I would prefer that you do the stuff that you really know, that's really dialed in, that's polished, and like that creates a great show because of the work that you've put in prior to that makes that show great. And the same thing is true for a speaker. I don't want to be in the audience where you're just testing material the whole time. So I've seen comedians before where they're in like a comedy club. I saw a guy a couple months ago who's a very good comedian. He has a Netflix special and is extremely good. But he did like 2 hours of material that was mostly him just kind of testing things, right? And so it's kind of entertaining, it's kind of interesting, but it's not a dialed in, polished set like what you would see on a Netflix special or a Comedy Central special or something like that. So all that to say, from a speaker standpoint, it's okay to give the same talk multiple times, but you do want to be aware if you're going to be speaking to an audience that you have spoke to before, then obviously you don't want to be doing the same material or telling the same stories or just doing the same talk. You want to be doing new material in that type of setting. So it sounds like this may be something where he has spoke here before, and so now he didn't want to just give the same talk a second time, and so he's coming up with new material or a different talk to present. Now, I'll also say from an intro standpoint, this is a bit of a slow kind of going here where he's kind of pacing. He's pretty much just staring down at the whole time. I didn't really talk about my book last time, so I figured I should talk about my book this time, and just kind of meandering his way through. Now, again, not a big fan of that. I would like to see him come in a bit more, polished and ready out of the gate. But at the same time, like we mentioned at the beginning, because he immediately has some built-in rapport and connection with the audience, he can get away with a little bit of this stuff that if he didn't have any of that rapport, it'd be a little bit harder to get away with this because he would immediately start losing the attention of the audience.
So I had to spend most of the day memorizing the rules. You'd think if you worked on something for 3 years, or it's been 5 years, I guess, you'd actually have it memorized. But memory is a very strange thing, and it's very particular and goal-oriented. And I actually didn't have the rules memorized, and certainly not their numbers. So hopefully I do by now. So I guess we're going to find out. But I have a copy of the book here in case I forget. So I think we'll go through them one by one, and we'll see how that goes. 7 o'clock, so all right, good. The first rule, which is kind of a comical rule, is stand up.
He is looking down a lot, right? He is just pacing. Now, oftentimes whenever we're looking down or we're looking somewhere or we're oftentimes thinking or we're looking at a different spot in the brain of where that information may be stored. Okay, now I'm no brain expert at all, but this is something I've heard referenced many times, is that when you're looking somewhere, you're looking where you think that is within the brain. And so oftentimes when we're looking down, we're thinking through what our next thing is, or in this case, he may be, it sounds like obviously he is an author, and so he may not be as comfortable as a speaker, and so he's kind of just working this out on stage. So ideally, especially these first few minutes here, these are really, really important, crucial minutes for building a rapport and a connection with the audience. So you want to be looking at the audience. It's okay from time to time to kind of glance down or to be processing, or as you're going from one side of the stage to the other to look down for a minute. But as much as possible, you want to be looking at the audience. You want to be engaging with the audience and not just staring at the ground.
Straight with your shoulders back. And it's a meditation, among other things, on the habits of lobsters. I read some papers on lobsters must be 10 years ago, I guess, and they just absolutely blew me away. And one of the things I've really loved about being a psychologist, and there's many things, but I've really loved psychoanalytic theory and the great clinicians, the behaviorists as well. I mean, Freud, Jung, Adler, Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, the behaviorists like Skinner and the cognitive behaviorists.
I've learned
a tremendous amount from reading the clinicians. And so if any of you are interested in psychology, I would really recommend reading the great clinicians, because you learn so much about life. It's crazy.
Now I'm going to make just kind of an observation here on the talk so far. It seems like this is not a real kind of polished talk. This is an audience, again, that's there to see him. They probably don't necessarily care that it needs to be some type of overly polished presentation or talk. So he's like, hey, I wrote a book. It has 12 different ideas, 12 different principles, and I'm just going to kind of riff on those 12 ideas. So this feels a bit more off the cuff, and it feels a bit more unscripted, which, can work in some settings. I'm generally not a fan of this because, as you can feel, we're several minutes in and he's just kind of meandering his way around physically, but also with the material as well. So again, you really want to know your material and know where it is that you're going with the audience. And so you're not just kind of meandering around.
By reading them. So that's been fun. But then on the entirely other end of the spectrum, where I've learned most about psychology, is from the really low, what would you call them, the really science-oriented animal behaviorists. That's where they turned into the neuroscientists, right? They were the animal behaviorists, first of all, and then they turned into the neuroscientists. And I've learned a tremendous amount from them. They're such clear thinkers. The best of the bunch, I think, there's two of them. One named Jeffrey Gray, who wrote a book called The Neuropsychology.
So did you notice there, again, he's not looking at the audience, he's just kind of like looking up in his head of like, okay, what were the names of those people? So again, not necessarily a bad thing at all. You can do some of that, but the more time that you're spending looking down, looking out, looking up, looking around, and not looking at the audience, then the more you'll start to disconnect from the audience.
Which is just a deadly book. It's impossible to read. It takes like 6 months to read it because I think he read
It's looking up again.
1,800 papers to write it or something like that. And he actually read them. That's the cool thing. And he understood them, which is really something. And then there's another guy named Jaak Panksepp who wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which outlines his studies, for example, of rats. He was the guy who learned that.
And this is a good setup right now, because again, every seat is filled. The whole place is just packed out. So again, from a speaker standpoint, that's exactly what you want. You want a room that feels too small. Oh, it looks too crowded. That's exactly what you want. Again, because it creates this energy, this buzz, this excitement, this momentum that if the room was half filled right now, it would feel dead. It would feel empty. And so this is a really, really, really good setup.
Rats laugh if you tickle them with the end of a pencil eraser, but they laugh ultrasonically like bats. So you have to slow down the ultrasonic vocalization before you can hear them giggle. And you'd think, why the hell would you spend your time tickling rats with a pencil and making them laugh? But see, what he demonstrated there was that there was a play circuit in mammals, that there's a psychobiological basis for rough and tumble play, for example. It's a bloody big deal, discovering a whole new circuit in the brain. That's like discovering a continent. It's Nobel Prize winning stuff. And Panksepp's Affective Neuroscience, I would highly recommend that. So there's this other book I know about too, which is 12 Rules for Life, which you could also look into if you want. Anyways, I was reading these articles on lobsters, and I came across this finding that lobsters governed their postural flexion with serotonin. And I thought, God, that's so interesting. It's so flexion is to stand up straight. Eh? I thought, wow, that's so interesting because, depressed people crouch over. I wonder if there's any link between those two things. And then I went and read a whole pile of papers on lobster and lobster neurochemistry. Lobster neurochemistry is actually quite well understood because they have a fairly simple nervous system, right? And so if you want to understand a complex nervous system, it's a good idea to understand a simple one first and then sort of elaborate upwards. And it turns out that...
Okay, let's make another observation here. So I have no idea who he is speaking to here in this type of setting. Obviously, this audience is very excited to see him and they're very familiar with him. Now, so far, this feels like a bit of a swim in the deep end. Now, this is why it's really, really important to know your audience. So to me, as an outsider looking in, I have no clue what he's talking about right now or where it is he's going with this presentation or this talk. But again, I'm not in the audience, right? So it's really, really important to make sure that you understand and are clear on your audience of where they're at, what their challenges are, what they're looking for. So you're not talking about X and they were planning on you talking about Y, or you're not talking about A, but really they're at stage B and you are way under talking to them versus talking to them on their level. So it's just, he may be like spot on with who he's speaking to, and I'm guessing he is. It looks like maybe perhaps a room of intellectuals here to see him speak, but just make sure that you know your audience and that you're very, very clear and that you're speaking to them, not above them and not below them.
Serotonin governs status. It governs status, emotional regulation, and posture in lobsters, just like it does in human beings. And so that just blew me away. And so
Lobsters. Is he saying lobsters? I thought he was saying loggers this whole time. I'm like, logger, where's he going with this? Lobsters. That might make a little more sense. We'll see.
One thing that chapter 1 is about is the fact that if a lobster is defeated in a dominance battle, you can give it essentially antidepressants and it will fight again. And that just blew me away. You know, it's so remarkable, because one of the things it tells you is that, so if you're imagine that you could be lobster top dog or bottom dog. Imagine there's 10 strata in the lobster hierarchy. So you could be number 1, right, top lobster, number 10, bottom lobster. If you're bottom lobster, you have low serotonin levels and high octopamine levels. That's a neurochemical that human beings don't produce. And if you're a top lobster, you have high serotonin levels and low octopamine levels. And you can move a lobster in its dominance hierarchy by moderating its levels of serotonin. And I thought that's so interesting, because what it means is that the counter that keeps track of our status, and we have a counter in a sense in our minds that keeps track of our status, is 1/3 of a billion.
Let's talk about movement for a second, because one thing that you're noticing that he's doing is he's spending a lot of time looking down, which we've covered, but he's spending a lot of time just going back and forth, just pacing back and forth, pacing back and forth, pacing back and forth. And so it's okay to move around the stage, and it's actually a good thing generally, but you want to be moving with purpose and have a reason to be moving. So if you're just kind of meandering around and you're just kind of walking around haphazardly, it starts to feel like, it almost looks like a caged animal that's just pacing back and forth. You ever been to the zoo and you see like a tiger that's in the cage and it's just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and there's no rhyme or reason, they're just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So if you're going to be moving, have a reason to be moving. Have a thought that you're going towards, or you're moving from, maybe you're telling a story and you're kind of moving in the timeline of where the story is going, or you started here and you planted and then you moved over to a different part of the stage and you planted and you tell a different section of the presentation. But just aimlessly going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth tends to not have any purpose, and it can oftentimes become distracting for the audience. All right, there you go. Hope you enjoyed that speech breakdown. Again, as always, if you like this, you want to see more of this, don't forget to comment below. Let us know what is the one takeaway that you learned that you're going to be applying to your next presentation or talk. Also, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel so that we can make sure that we keep sending you quality speech breakdowns like this one. All right, my friends, we'll catch you next time. You're awesome.